All right, we're at 9:01, so I think we're going to jump right in. Good morning. I'm Tamara Small, CEO of NAIOP Massachusetts, the Commercial Real Estate Development Association, and it is my pleasure to welcome you today to our informational session that we are co-hosting along with the 495 MetroWest Partnership and the EPA. Today, we will be hearing about the draft Residual Designation Authority, also often referred to as the RDA permit. This is something that NAIOP and the 495 Partnership have been following in various forms for, I think, about 15 years now. So it's back, and we are eager to get your feedback today after we hear from EPA. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason Palich from the 495 Partnership. Jason.
Thank you, Tamara. And on behalf of the 495 MetroWest Partnership, I want to thank all of you for joining us this morning for an important discussion on a topic of relevance both to our natural resources and to economic development. I want to thank Tamara and her team at NAIOP for co-hosting this morning's presentation along with us. By way of background, the 495 MetroWest Partnership is the regional economic development organization for 36 cities and towns along the 495 MetroWest corridor. Before we get underway this morning, I do just want to review a few housekeeping items briefly. All attendees are automatically muted upon logging in this morning, though you do have the ability to unmute yourself. We ask that you please do not unmute yourself unless you intend imminently to speak to help cut down on background noise. There will be designated time for Q&A after the presentation this morning, which I will help moderate. You can ask questions by typing them into the chat function, and we will monitor them and read them aloud to our presenters. You can also utilize the raise hand function if you'd like to ask your question live. While you're welcome to utilize the chat to enter questions at any time, if you intend to ask a live question, please wait until the presentation has ended and we're in the designated Q&A period. While we understand that this can be a highly technical topic, we do also ask that you keep questions as succinct as possible to better enable our ability to present them to the EPA team and to discuss them. If it's something that might be too long or too technical to address on the call today, EPA will certainly be outlining their process by which you can reach out to them in the future. I do also want to note we're going to be recording just the presentation portion of this morning's event. When we get to the discussion Q&A, we will stop the recording for that time. And lastly, before I turn things over to the EPA team, I just want to encourage all of our stakeholders to actively engage with this conversation and this process. Whether you come today with concerns or with excitement, your voice is welcomed as part of this dialogue. EPA has made very clear, both to NAIOP and the partnership, their desire for active engagement, especially with the business community. They've designed a process by which your feedback will be considered as they develop this permit, which they will outline during their presentation. Regardless of your perspective, you will be better served by engaging with the process now than you would be by waiting to see if the outcome involves something you don't like. So we're encouraging you to lean in. If for some reason you're not comfortable engaging directly with or expressing yourself directly to the EPA team, you're welcome to contact Tamara, myself, the partnership, or NAIOP, and we'd be happy to facilitate that communication for you. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Patrick Field of CBI, who's our facilitator this morning and who's going to introduce our presenters from EPA.
Great, Jason, thank you. And thank you, the partnership and NAIOP, for really helping sponsor this, and appreciate people joining this morning. I'm a facilitator with the Consensus Building Institute, along with Abby Fulham with me today. And we're going to be kind of just helping facilitate, and we'll also be taking some notes from all the good kind of commentary and notes without attribution that you share. What I want to do first is introduce the EPA team. I'll describe, kind of run a show, and then we'll dive right in. So Anne, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Ann Libby. I am a senior advisor in the Water Division, and I'm co-leading this effort with Laura Schiffman.
Great. Laura.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Laura Schiffman. I'm the technical lead on this permit project.
Great. Ken.
I'm Ken Moraff. I'm the director of the Water Division.
Great. Erin.
I'm Erin Flannery Keith, an attorney in the Office of Regional Counsel.
Lynn.
Good morning. I'm Lynn Jennings. I'm the branch manager of our NIPD's permitting branch.
Great. Damien.
Good morning, everyone. Damien Houlihan. I am the manager of the stormwater permitting section.
And Thelma.
Good morning. I'm Thelma Murphy. I'm the Deputy Water Division Director.
Great. And Michelle? Not sure if she's going to join us now or later. Okay. Anybody else from EPA that I missed? Okay, great. So what we're going to do is EPA, starting off with Ken, is going to give a presentation about background and kind of current status of the developing permit. And then that'll be probably 25 minutes or half an hour Then what we want to do is move to kind of clarifying questions, as Jason said, in chat or with hand raise, to go through 10 or 12 minutes. And then we do have four very specific kind of themes or issues that 495 folks actually raised in a letter they sent to EPA several months ago. So we want to kind of hone in on those and have some dialogue if we can, with some initial ideas brainstorming for those four. And then we'll do a little bit of a Zoom poll at the end to capture more information from you all. It will be very helpful. And then we'll talk about next steps and close. And appreciate people being here. And as Jason said, whatever your viewpoint on this issue, glad you're here, want to engage, and I think an important opportunity to really be in dialogue with EPA as they develop this permit, which is pretty unusual for them to be doing that, which I think is a good part about engagement here that will be helpful. So with that, Ken, I'm going to turn it over to you to, I think, kick things off.
Great, thank you. Well, first I want to say thank you all for taking time out of your schedules this morning. It's great to see you here. We held focus groups on this topic in 2020 with both NAIOP and the 495 Partnership, and this is a follow-up to those discussions. At that time in 2020, we talked about a petition that EPA had received asking us to develop a stormwater permitting program for privately owned properties in the Charles River watershed, and we noted that we had just received two similar petitions for the Mystic and Neponset rivers. And those petitions were all designed to address some critical water quality problems in these three rivers. So at this meeting, we'd like to update you on what has happened since then. You're probably aware that in 2022, we issued a draft determination that we would move forward with this program, and we're now working on a draft permit. It's really important to us, as Pat said, to keep you informed and to seek your feedback as we develop that draft permit. And in a few minutes, you're going to hear from Ann Libby and Laura Schiffman about our progress on that permit. They'll talk about the technical basis behind it. They'll talk about the stakeholder outreach that we're doing. But we hope that after that presentation, that today's meeting is going to include a conversation around some of the permit issues. We'd like to talk about some of the concerns that we've already heard from some of you and other stakeholders. And we'd like to talk about specific issues and potential solutions. And I guess before we dive in, I want to say this level of enhanced early outreach is pretty unique at EPA. We don't normally initiate this kind of public engagement before the release of a draft permit. There's a whole public process once we release a draft permit where we take comments and respond to them. But this is an unusual process where even before we've drafted that first version of the permit for comment, we wanted to reach out and really understand your perspective as the ones who are going to need to implement this permit. And we want to make sure that we write it in a way that's practical and achievable. So that's why we're here this morning. And I'm really looking forward to a good discussion. So one thing I want to note right at the start is we are, all of us, aware that the development and management of commercial property in Massachusetts is already quite complex. There are a lot of requirements at both the federal, state, and local levels, and we understand that this challenge has only grown in recent years, and that you're all coping with what does the world look like after the pandemic, the high cost of borrowing, other issues. We're all aware of that, and we realize that there may be some very understandable concerns about what additional costs might be connected with this permit. And we also understand some of you are here representing municipalities who are trying to think through what does it mean to administer this permit, what additional burdens might it create for municipalities. So we really want to dive into those issues with you. We're engaged in this because restoring water quality in these rivers is a critical part of EPA's mission, but it's also really important for us to design this program in a way that works for the people who need to implement it. So we have a lot to tell you about where we are and the progress we're making, but we're also really here to listen. Next slide. So during the presentation, I'm going to explain why EPA is developing this permit now and how it will help us clean up our rivers. And then Ann is going to talk about where we are in the process, give you some more details. And then Laura is going to talk about the technical basis for the permit and highlight some of the types of stormwater controls that could result from this permit. And once we've done that, we'd like to have a discussion that Pat will facilitate about how EPA can design a permitting program that takes into consideration the concerns that we've already heard or that you may raise today. I want to note that all the numbers and graphics you're going to see and any technical conclusions that we talk about today are all pre-decisional. They're subject to change. We're going to go through a whole public process on this permit. So what you see today may be different than what you see when we go public with a draft and a final permit. This is part of a very early stage outreach. So we're still at a point where things could change. Okay, so next slide. Why is EPA developing this permit right now? So first, kind of taking the step back at just where we are with water pollution issues in Greater Boston. Over the last few decades, that all of the communities in the Boston area have invested hundreds of millions of dollars to clean up our waterways. Sorry, while I turn on my lights. Okay, so this whole area has invested hundreds of millions of dollars, mostly from water and sewer ratepayers, to clean up our waterways, including these three rivers. And as a result of those investments, many sources of pollution have been eliminated or greatly reduced. And the last major source that's left in these rivers is stormwater runoff. And as you'll hear later in the presentation, EPA has already issued stormwater permits to municipalities, requiring them to make very significant reductions in their pollutant loads from stormwater over a 20-year period. Every community is now implementing its own plan to meet those targets. Runoff from private properties is the last major source of pollution that has not yet been addressed. And this permitting program is designed to fill that gap. As some of you know, but some of you may not, this is not the first time that EPA has considered this type of stormwater permit program for the private sector. In 2010, we developed a pilot program for 3 communities in the Upper Charles River Watershed, Franklin, Bellingham, and Milford. At the time, we received strong feedback from a number of stakeholders, including NAIOP and the 495 Partnership, that pilot program was premature because EPA at that point had not yet set pollution reduction targets for municipalities. The municipalities didn't have a permit that required them to make this kind of reduction. And we heard a lot of concerns about the fairness of putting this burden on the private sector before the municipalities were also engaged. And we also heard very strong feedback that if we did a permit program, it should be watershed wide and not single out individual communities. So we gave that feedback some very careful consideration, and in the end, decided that it made sense, and we did not proceed with the pilot at that point, and instead shifted our focus to developing the municipal stormwater requirements first, and with the idea to return to the private sector once the municipal framework was in place. And that's where we are now. So that's why we're working on this at this point in history. The municipalities are already working hard and investing a lot to clean up their own stormwater. And our goal is to design a permit for the private sector in a way that complements the municipal work and helps us meet the overall pollution reduction goals for these rivers. One other thing to keep in mind is that while EPA was considering, I mentioned we got petitions from environmental groups to establish this program. While we were considering how to respond to those petitions, the environmental groups filed a lawsuit in federal court. They argued that we had unreasonably delayed our action, and the court has stayed that lawsuit until early fall of this year. And so our goal is to issue a draft permit by then. So that's some of the backdrop. Next slide. So what are we trying to achieve with this permit? The most important goal is to clean up these 3 rivers. And you're going to hear in a little more detail more about how we know that stormwater is the last major remaining source and what that means. And so together with the work being done by municipalities, this permit that we're developing will help restore these rivers to environmental health so that they can really become the assets they should be for our communities. Now, we know that a lot of you and a lot of property owners in Massachusetts are already taking very important steps to manage stormwater runoff. One thing this permit will do is it'll help establish a level playing field so that everyone is doing their fair share, and it will also help ensure that the whole burden doesn't fall on municipalities. Having said that, we do want to make sure that we allow permittees as much flexibility as possible to manage their own properties. And Laura will talk a little more about how we're thinking about that. And that's another area where we really would like your input. Next slide. We're really interested in your questions. A lot of important issues have already been raised. The 495 Partnership sent us a letter last year with a lot of thoughtful questions. You can see a screenshot. This letter, the full text is on our website, as is a lot of other information about this program. Some of the questions in this letter about the role of EPA, the types of stormwater control measures that might be required, are questions we can answer, and we'll try to do that today and in future conversations. There are other questions, for example, about the role of Mass DEP and in several different areas are ones that EPA can't fully answer since they depend on decisions by the Commonwealth. Those answers may evolve over time as DEP develops its approach to these issues. We're, of course, in close communication with DEP, and we will be transparent as this evolves about where things stand on those issues. Some of the questions raise really important questions about how the permit will be structured or implemented. And on those issues, we would very much like to engage with you. We want to make sure that this permit is developed in a way that makes it as easy to implement as possible. We want to hear what you need from EPA as this program develops. So we hope to hear some real feedback from you today. We know these are complicated issues and some of you are new to this process. And so I do want to say we plan to continue the conversation with focus groups on specific permit implementation topics. So we encourage you to participate in future discussions if you want to weigh in or learn more about specific issues. And you'll have a chance later in the meeting to tell us if you would like to participate in those future discussions. So the bottom line is we do want to work with you to build a permit approach that is going to meet our clean water goals. We have to do that. That's our job. But we want to do it in a way that allows property owners to implement stormwater controls on a timeline that's predictable and achievable, and that's workable. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we've already heard a number of questions about permit implementation from a number of stakeholders, including your organizations. And at the end of this presentation, we're going to start discussing those issues. They fall into several categories, including questions about how the permit will be administered, questions about the type of controls that might be required, questions about the impact that the permit might have on local funding mechanisms. For example, what does it mean if a community has established a stormwater utility? How will this permit relate to that? And finally, questions about the role EPA should play, including what kind of support is needed from us for administration of the permit and for assistance with compliance with the permit. So before we get to that discussion, I'm going to turn it over first to Ann Libby to talk about the current petition and permitting process and where we are with stakeholder outreach overall. Ann.
Thank you so much, Ken. So many of you are aware of where this all comes from, but maybe everyone isn't. So we thought we'd just look at a little bit of the kind of legal basis for this permit, where we are with respect to the actual permitting process, and then just say a few more specific words about the stakeholder engagement process that we're engaged in. So the Clean Water Act, Section 402P, is the section of the law that authorizes EPA to issue NPDES permits. So we do that for specific sources like industrial sources, municipal wastewater treatment plants, and MS4s for stormwater. But there is additional authority in that provision of the Clean Water Act that allows us to regulate residual sources of runoff. So that authority can be used to require an NPDES permit when if several conditions exist. If the discharge contributes to a violation of water quality standards, if they are a significant contributor of a pollutant to federally protected waters, or if controls are needed for the discharge based upon a wastewater allocation for a TMDL. Next slide. So this slide, there's a lot of words on it, but it basically explains how we got to where we are today. So just to review the details for those of you who aren't aware, in 2019, the Conservation Law Foundation and the Charles River Watershed Association issued a request that EPA exercise its residual designation authority for the Charles River. The Conservation Law Foundation followed that petition in 2020 with petitions for the Mystic and the Neponset. Basically, those petitions requested that all commercial, industrial, and institutional properties of 1 acre or greater and larger multifamily units of 5 units or more be designated for residual designation. In September of 2022, EPA issued a preliminary determination that designated all CII parcels, but not multifamily units, with 1 acre or more of impervious cover. So we decided that we would use impervious cover as the limit in the Charles, the Mystic, and the Neponset River watersheds. At this point, EPA is moving forward with the development of a permitting framework and an outreach strategy as Ken said, a goal of issuing a draft permit in the fall of 2024. Next slide. So just to be really clear on the permitting timeline, so the draft permit is set to issue in fall of 2024. That will be followed by a public comment period that will last for at least 30 days. EPA is looking forward to receiving comments from all members of the public on this draft permit, as well as its preliminary determination for the RDA process. After it has considered those comments, it will issue a final permit and determination in a response to public comments. Next slide. So the stakeholder outreach timeline, I want to turn to that now. So many of you were engaged in 2020. We had 5 focus groups with many different groups, including NAIOP and the 495 Partnership. We published with CBI's assistance a report, which is available on our website, that talked about the really significant themes, concerns, and issues that people had when this RDA process was first being considered. So the goal here is we've been re-engaging with stakeholders across all 3 watersheds. We've already had conversations similar to this one with the 3 watershed groups with Mass Rivers Alliance. In early April, we will be talking to hospitals and colleges and universities. And then in mid-April, we'll be talking to municipalities in partnership with the Mass Municipal Association and others. So that's where we're at right now. Really, as Ken said, we're seeking feedback on permit implementation challenges. And we're hoping that as you identify these challenges, that you also can come forward with some of the solutions that we may be able to implement into our permit with some of those suggestions. As we incorporate that feedback, this summer we'll be refining the options in the permitting framework with a goal of issuing the permit in the fall. Next slide. All right, so EPA really has 3 goals as part of the stakeholder outreach. One of the most important things is you keep hearing us say is the importance for feedback. So we are hearing a lot of very similar themes, some of which we're going to talk about later today across all of the entities and different groups that we've been talking about. The feedback ranges from lots of issues about permit implementation and permit administration. What is the role of municipalities going to be? Who should we be targeting first? Landowners? Should we be phasing this permit? What about the impact of multiple regulations? The intersection between MS4 and RDA, potential inconsistencies between local, state, and federal regulations, the impact on funding. Will this program provide incentives for the development of stormwater utilities? EPA thinks that it could, but others disagree with that. We'd like to hear your thoughts on that. And of course, we'll be considering how this impact has an impact on environmental justice communities. There's some things we aren't seeking feedback at this point. So things like whether or not we should be doing this, the technical and legal requirements that we have to actually pursue as part of this permit. and any consensus position. We're not looking for consensus because that would be a violation of FACA, but we are looking for feedback on a lot of these other things. We're also trying to share information. Hopefully that's obvious at this point. We're developing a range of different tools. There's an RDA data tracker that's going to help municipalities understand which facilities are implicated in their communities and the amount of phosphorus that will be coming from their municipalities. We already have online, many of you may have already seen, we've developed individualized fact sheets for every community in all 3 watersheds that helps explain what the impact is in their community in terms of the number of parcels and the phosphorus runoff that's happening. We're developing a 2-page informational fact sheet that will be written, just for more general consumption, because this is hard for folks to understand, and it has a wide impact across communities. And then we're also developing a Q&A. We're particularly interested if there's things in the Q&A that you would like to have us put in there so that we can better describe to all of our stakeholders what this process is all about. And finally, the third goal that EPA has in this process is to foster external collaborations. We really don't have, we won't be part of that. We're busy writing the permit, but we do really hope and wonder if there'll be, external collaborations that will be incentivized by this. One can look at what's going on in Long Creek, Maine to see an example of what is possible with respect to external actions. There's going to be a lot of issues around offsite mitigation, potentially crediting, stormwater utilities. Are there things that this process will incentivize? And we certainly hope that there are productive things that can happen on that front. Next slide. So this, in a nutshell, is where you can find additional resources that EPA is putting out into the world. Again, this is highly unusual for EPA to be spending this kind of resources on trying very genuinely to try to be both transparent and to provide useful information on what we are trying to do with this permit. So the website is listed there. In that website, if you kind of dig around in there, you'll find many things. You'll find the 3 RDA petitions that were filed for the Charles, the Mystic, and the Neponset. You'll find EPA's initial RDA designation really stating our initial reasons for why we're doing this. Laura and I are providing monthly RDA updates on where we are with respect to permit development, as well as some of the outreach efforts and tools that we are both writing and posting online. You'll find the parcel level analysis for all 3 watersheds. So that is a useful document for those of you who are trying to understand the technical basis for why EPA is doing what it's doing. That is available on our website. As I said, there are tools and informational fact sheets. And finally, we are keeping a list of all the stakeholder events as well as upcoming focus groups that we will be having. So check out the website. And as I said, we're trying to keep that up to date on a monthly basis. Finally, if you have feedback on permit implementation challenges or ideas for solutions, we are interested in hearing that in any form that you are interested in providing. Jason, you did just such a great introduction with this in terms of saying and clarifying how EPA really is trying to open a dialogue, and that the time is now to try to engage in that. The thing that's going to be the most useful, though, are ideas that are associated with potential solutions for what EPA should, how we might be thinking about some of these permit terms. So anyways, you can email us if you have those types of ideas at region1.rda@epa.gov. And I think now it's Laura's turn, and I will turn it over to Laura. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Anne. So I'm going to go over a little bit more of the technical aspects of where we stand with this permitting framework. As Ken had mentioned in his portion of the presentation, our region has already really seen a lot of improvements in water quality over the years. The major sources of nutrient pollution that we're generally tackling are combined sewer overflows, illicit discharges from wastewater treatment facilities, and of course, stormwater. We've successfully so far eliminated about 99.5% of CSOs and illicit discharges. CSOs are combined sewer overflows in the rivers of the Boston area since the 1970s. And this has really resulted in some measurable improvements in pathogen and other pollutant concentrations in the rivers. Then since the introduction of TMDLs, basically watershed cleanup plan or watershed management plans In the early 2000s, wastewater treatment facilities are addressing another big source of nutrient loads as they're required to remove about 90% of phosphorus from their discharges. And then with the 2016 MS4 permit that's been mentioned a few times now, municipalities have started to invest lots of money and time into building comprehensive stormwater programs that aim to address this big remaining source of phosphorus pollution. And while the municipalities are responsible for managing the stormwater and nutrient challenge, the land from which this runoff stems is not all owned by municipalities, as you know. In fact, in the Charles, Mystic, and Neponset rivers, the area of land that's covered by private properties, like the ones called out by the RDA petitions, is about 14 to 18% of the watersheds. So it's a pretty decent chunk. This RDA program will therefore distribute this responsibility of stormwater management between the municipalities and large private landowners accordingly. But again, this is a residual designation program, so the MS4 permit will remain the primary regulatory mechanism for stormwater management at the municipal scale. So how did EPA determine what kinds of properties are included in this program based on what's written in these petitions that we receive? And we'll talk about that in the next slide. So we looked at the tax assessor's codes for each municipality, and that each municipality assigned to properties within its boundaries. And based on this, EPA then narrowed down the tax use codes that had descriptions that matched the land uses that were called out in the petitions: commercial, industrial, and institutional land uses. This information was then overlaid with the 2016 Mass GIS land use land cover database, and using a geospatial analysis program, we've calculated the impervious cover for each parcel. You'll see on the next slide how we've used this resulting information to come up with a permitting threshold of an acre of impervious cover, where we really tried to aim to balance the environmental impact that we can have with this program while limiting the number of parcels that are eligible for permitting. And you can find the specific reports related to this analysis on the website that Anne also just mentioned, and that Abby placed in the chat. Next slide, thank you. So here you see three graphs that show the results of the geospatial analysis for these three watersheds. On the x-axis on the bottom, you can see the number of private CII, commercial, institutional, and industrial parcels that were identified during the analysis for permitting. And then on the vertical y-axis, you can see the potential pollution reduction that can be achieved by permitting these parcels. Each data point represents the size of a parcel that could be receiving a permit. So on the bottom left, we start with 5 or more acres of impervious cover parcels that would be identified, then 2 acres or more of impervious cover, then 1, then 1/2, and then 1/4 acre, and then all parcels. These are again just commercial, institutional, industrial parcels with this type of impervious cover on them. And then you'll see that if you look at the sort of trajectory of the graph for each of the watersheds, the line connecting the data points from the bottom left to the top right gets flatter as you move along the graph, meaning that the additional increment of pollution reduction that's being achieved by permitting an increased number of parcel becomes smaller and smaller. So our sort of the environmental gain starts to lessen as we pull in more and more parcels. And so for all of the three watersheds, what we call the knee of the curve lies around the 1 acre of impervious cover threshold. And that's where EPA felt like the trade-off between environmental impact and the number of permit parcels was optimized. And so that's what you will find in the preliminary determination that's been that EPA put out in September of 2022, and that's on our website. And the EPA has also heard from other stakeholders about the benefits of phasing this permit in, and this is something that we're actually considering and we'd like to hear more feedback on. But with this permitting threshold that's set to about 1 acre of impervious cover, the end goal that we'll probably end up with through this RDA program will result in about an 8.8% contribution of total phosphorus pollution reduction in the Charles. In the Mystic, it'll be 12.1%. In the Neponset River, 9.1%. And again, this is a portion that's contributing to municipal load reductions. And then on the next slide, you'll see what kind of tools EPA is considering for property owners under this permitting framework. So we really expect to kind of create a menu of options that permittees can use to make decisions about which stormwater controls are best suited for their property type. In this list, we show the kinds of different stormwater control measures EPA is considering for this permitting program. Those of you who are familiar with the municipal stormwater program will recognize this list. And in fact, it's actually the same list as the one that's found in the MS4 permit, but we're open to really hearing about some potential other options as we develop this permitting framework. EPA wants to ensure that permittees can find stormwater controls that work for their site, knowing that there may be site constraints due to limited space, high groundwater, contaminated soil, conflicts of state, local, and federal requirements, or other challenges that make the placement of some of these stormwater controls challenging. Some of these stormwater practices could provide important pro-benefits to landowners and communities. They could increase infiltration where it makes sense and replenish groundwater supplies, reduce flooding, reduce the heat island effect, increase carbon capture, and even beautify neighborhoods through the planting of trees and installation of rain gardens. And that's one reason why we want to allow for flexibility in the choice of stormwater controls so property owners can choose options that will have multiple benefits. But we understand that structural controls are not the only way to meet permit requirements. We acknowledge that the implementation of these structural controls is not always easy, like I mentioned before. But also due to the potential challenges, again, with these conflicting guidelines and requirements at the federal, state, and local level. We're also aware that structural controls can be really costly to install. And so we're really interested in hearing about economies of scale for approaches to stormwater management. We're also considering other management practices like street sweeping that can also achieve important pollution reductions and could be part of an overall plan to meet targets. Could be a combination approach, for example. One additional piece of information I want to point out, and that was mentioned by Anne also, was the Long Creek Water Management District in Maine that has taken a regionalized approach for its RDA permittees, where the permittees pay fees to this management district. And the management district then relies on economies of scale to manage the implementation and maintenance of stormwater controls within the watershed to meet RDA permit terms. So this is one way to take an approach that's regionalized, that takes advantage of offsite mitigation, and still addresses stormwater pollution. So we're curious to hear more about these kinds of questions on this program. And this is something we're really seeking a lot of feedback on, but I'm going to turn it over to Jason now to facilitate some of the clarifying questions.
Great. So with that, I think we're going to go ahead and stop the recording. If I can manage to do that.